I'm currently at the University of Guelph studying wildlife conservation biology. So the topic that I'm speaking on today is Ontario pollinators, and it really does lie close to my heart. I love little critters, so I'm hoping I'll be able to share some of that passion with you. There we go. All right, so first off, the major question that I get from when I give this presentation, place I like to start, is what is pollination? What does it actually encompass? So pollination is fertilization of plants. So to do this, we're going to talk a little bit about the structures involved in the flower of a plant and how pollination actually occurs. So the male portion of the plant is called the stamen, and it involves two major parts. First is the anther, which is the part on the end of the filament, and that's where your pollen grains actually come from. So when the pollen is transferred to the stigma, which is the female part of the plant, there's actually a sticky substance that helps that pollen adhere to the end of the stigma. The pollen grain then shoots a tubule down through the stigma, and the nuclei of that pollen grain is what travels down that tubule and actually causes the fertilization of that plant. Where that happens within the ovule is where your fruiting body will actually grow. So if you think of apples, if you think of blueberries, that fruit actually develops around where that pollination happened. So there's a couple different types of pollination. The first one is self-pollination. So this is a situation in which the plant or flower actually pollinates itself. So it's from the same flower to the same flower. The other type is cross-pollination. So this is from one flower to either another flower, even if it's on the same plant, or to a flower of the same type of plant in a different location. We're going to talk predominantly about cross-pollination today because that's what pollinators are used for. Now, within pollination, there's, again, those two main types. So you have wind pollination. That strategy is typically what your conifers or pine trees and a lot of grasses use. So the kind of benefit of this is that they don't rely on pollinators. So you have the plant producing a lot of pollen. So if you have seasonal allergies, these are the types of plants you're reacting to. So things like ragweed, they produce a lot of pollen, the wind comes, the pollen just goes everywhere, and hopefully it lands on the right plant. The kind of con of this, the downside, is that they do have to produce a lot of pollen, and it's a bit up to chance on whether or not they successfully are able to pass on their genes. Versus animal pollination, the plant instead puts a lot of its energy resources into producing something that is attractive to pollinators. So whether this is a lot of nectar, whether this is a flower, whether it's a nice scent, it's going to develop something that attracts pollinators to then carry its pollen, hopefully, to the same type of plant elsewhere. Now, there are certain plants that have developed really close relationships with specific pollinators, and so they have a better chance of having their pollen passed on to the same species so that they can then pass their genes on to the next generation. With this, there are different styles of pollen grain that the plants will produce. I do have a few members out here, so I'm going to ask, raise your hand if you think the spiky pollen is wind pollinator made. All right, raise your hand if you think it's animal pollinator made. Yeah, okay, everybody's on team here. So the shape of the pollen grain is actually going to be different depending on the pollination strategy that the plant has. So those spiky pollen grains, like everyone thought, are specifically this one's from a sunflower plant, but what they do is they attach like a little teeny tiny burr to a part of the pollinator species that is visiting that animal, and so it's that's visiting that plant, so it's easier to pass on. The one in kind of the top corner, that's from a type of mustard plant, and it is predominantly wind pollinated, but also can be animal pollinated, which is why it's kind of like an in-between. And then the bottom one that's completely smooth all the way around is from Timothy grass, 100% wind pollinated. It is meant to be more aerodynamic, so it can go further and hopefully fertilize more plants. Now, we're talking about pollination, we're talking about pollinators. Why is it important? What does pollination have to do with anything? There are a lot of different impacts that pollination has. Some environmental impacts include genetic diversity. So without pollination, cross-pollination, crop plants wouldn't have the genetic diversity that they do and the ability to fight off things like disease. So some examples in our history include bananas. At a certain point in time, the banana plant almost went extinct because it didn't have the genetic diversity to be able to fend off a certain type of disease. Whether this is fungal, bacterial, or viral, plants have diseases just like animals do. And if they don't have a large gene pool in the population, anything that affects one plant is going to affect them all. So genetic diversity within agriculture crops or wild species is really important for the survival of that species. Biodiversity is another big one. So flowering plants rely 80%, or more than 80%, of flowering plants on Earth rely on pollinators. So the diversity of the plants within an ecosystem, not just genetic, but the species themselves are going to be affected by pollination. And then another point, wildlife will rely not only for food, but also for shelter. So I like this little picture. I think it does a good job. Mice, a lot of times when we think of animals, we think of like larger scale creatures that will be eating these plants. Mice rely not only for food, but also for their nest matter, for lining their burrows, and for shelter from predators. Now, economic impact. This is a big one. We are at the agricultural winter fair. So the economic impacts of pollination are massive. Within Canada, there's $1.2 billion worth of horticulture plants produced each year. That is a massive industry. Without fertilization, you wouldn't have fruits, many vegetables. You wouldn't be able to produce the seeds to grow next year's crops. So for the production of food, it is essential. Field crops like canola and alfalfa benefit from pollinators' activity, and approximately 90% of the yield is directly related to the pollination, from specific pollinator species. Animal agriculture also benefits from pollinators a bit indirectly, where you're growing your animals. What are you going to feed your animals? Many of our agriculture species rely on plants pollinated by pollinators. So things like alfalfa rely on pollinators. That's a huge portion of the feed that you're going to use, especially when raising cattle. And then directly, we've got orchards, so things, again, like apples or fields of blueberries. These are all going to rely heavily on pollinators. 30% of what you eat every single day comes directly from pollinated plants. 60% of what you eat every day is related indirectly to pollinators. So overall, between 60 and 90% of what you're eating has to do with pollinated species. So next time you take a bite, every 2 out of 3 bites, thank a pollinator. Specifically, some crops within Canada that are going to rely on pollinators. I've already mentioned blueberries and apples, but canola is a huge one. So canola actually stands for Canadian oil. It was developed in Canada, which is pretty cool, to be able to grow in the prairies where there might not be the best growth conditions for other types of crops that we have historically grown. We are the largest producer in the world and the second largest producer of blueberries, which I think is kind of awesome. So if you're somebody who likes blueberries, you're in the right place. 70% of fruit and vegetables and seed crops will rely on pollinators. And like I said before, major feed forages, so things like alfalfa and clover. And then if you look down, your jeans, your sweater, your shirt, if any of those things are cotton, cotton also relies on pollinators. So not only what you eat, but also the fiber and textile industries are influenced by pollinators. Now, what pollinators are here in Ontario? This is a question I get a lot, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different species that are involved in pollination across the province. So, the big bee. Bees are typically the first thing that come to mind when I say pollinator species. So, while honeybees are usually kind of top of mind, Ontario is home to over 400 different species of bees, including what's pictured here is a russet stripe bumblebee, which personally I love bumblebees. I think they are like the golden retriever of the bee world. They're just so fluffy and cute. There's actually 16 different species of bumblebee in Ontario, which I think is pretty awesome. We also have other species like sweat bees, carpenter bees, leaf cutter bees, and mining bees. So while we often think of honeybees first, the native species of Ontario include a lot more different species of bees. So yay for bees. Birds. This is not as common a thought when you think about pollinators. So specifically within Ontario, we have the red-throated hummingbird. Like I said, they're less common, but they're still very important, especially because hummingbirds tend to pollinate the flowers that bees don't. The red-throated hummingbird is the only hummingbird kind of native to this region, but as things are warming, we're starting to see range shifts of other pollinator or other hummingbird species kind of moving north. So it is possible we'll start to see, especially in like southern Ontario, different types of hummingbirds starting to come up visiting feeders, visiting our gardens and such. So hummingbirds also play a role in pollination of different types of plants. Moths, again, we don't always think about moths as pollinators. This is another one that is really close to my heart. I can't get over their little like antenna, their like fluffy little bodies. They're very cute. I'm a huge fan of moths. And because of the coevolution between flowering plants and insects, moths are really important, and we'll touch on this a bit later, because of the time of day or night that they're active. Mammals, again, maybe less commonly thought of. There aren't a lot of mammals that pollinate on purpose, but bats are a good example of this. So while they may not directly aim to pollinate, like that's not maybe like what they're thinking of, they are often visitors to agricultural fields and orchards because they're hunting the insects that are either pest species or just abundant in those areas. And so by visiting these trees and areas, they do pass on a certain amount of pollen when they go to sit and rest while they're waiting to kind of like ambush their prey. So they do still play a role within the pollination network. Butterflies are another one. I think if anyone has the chance, if they're in this area, we do have multiple butterfly conservatories where you can go and see different species of butterflies. But within Ontario, we have over 100 species that will visit gardens, visit fields, and contribute to the pollination of those plants. Beetles, again, I think are kind of a funny one. You don't think of them necessarily as pollinators because they're not fluffy. Where does the pollen stick to? What do they even pollinate? They're just, they're kind of there. We don't always, think of them as being a key pollinator species, but they really are. Oftentimes, beetles will be visiting flowers that, bees don't necessarily. So you think of flowers that don't necessarily have a lot of nectar. Beetles will be visiting those, like the really small flowers, because they are eating the pollen, or they're attracted by the scent. So they scuttle over the surface, the pollen grains stick to their feet, they stick to their underbodies, and in that way, they are able to pollinate the plant really effectively. And last but certainly not least, we have flies. While I know that this kind of looks like a bee, this is called mimicry, and some species do adopt this where they look like a more quotes here, dangerous species to help ward off predators. So if a predator has ever gotten stung by a bee and they see this flying around, they go, oh, maybe I don't want to eat that thing because it might sting me. So that is why this fly, it's called a hoverfly, looks a little bit like a bee. Now there's two different types of flies that pollinate. The first is called a flower fly, which makes sense, they visit flowers. The other, unfortunately, is deemed a filth fly, and they're the ones that are attracted to maybe not so nice scents. They pollinate very different flowers, so it is good that we have both groups because different plants, like I said, they've developed different strategies to be able to be pollinated by different species. So all of these organisms together contribute to the ecosystems that they live in, and they play an invaluable role in both the environment and our agri-food systems. So again, 2 out of 3 bites you take, thank a pollinator. It can be any of these, but we appreciate them. Now, we're going to touch briefly on these 3 terms because they are often talked about but not often understood. The difference between a native species, an invasive species, and a naturalized species. So, out of the 3 here, who thinks the first one is native? Put up your hand. We got 1. Who thinks it's invasive? Put up your hand. Maybe 1 shy one. And who thinks it's naturalized? Put up your hand. Okay, so we've got most votes for naturalized. What about the middle species? Who thinks it's native? 1. Who thinks it's invasive? Almost everybody. And who thinks it's naturalized? Got 1. Okay, and the last species with the pink flower. Who thinks it's native? Most people. Okay, who thinks it's invasive? 1. And who thinks it's naturalized? Okay, so we've got a good mix. I think this is a really fun question to ask because I always get different answers. So I'll let you in on a secret. That first species, that green bee, it is actually a bee, is native to Canada. So that's called a sweat bee. And they're a very effective pollinator that is native around here. And sometimes you might see them if you're, out on the sidelines of a soccer field. In the summer, they like high humidity regions, but they're very, very common across the province. The middle one is called the Great Northern Hornet, and it is invasive. You guys got that right. This is a newly invasive species. It was first found in British Columbia in 2019 and has since been put on the pest watch list, and it is unfortunately moving across Canada. So you'll be able to tell the difference between this and our native species because they are giant. They earned their name. They are, a couple inches long. And if you hold it in your hand next to one of our native species, our bees are small. And then the last on the list, most people actually said this one was native. This is our honeybee. We love them, but they are a naturalized species. They were not native to Canada. They came over from Europe. They were imported when Canada was colonized. So the big difference between these 3 definitions, so a native species is present in a region due to local evolution throughout history. So that's the main sticking point, is that it has evolved in that specific region. Versus an invasive species is a species that's not indigenous to a region, and when it gets introduced, it kind of has a population boom. It becomes way overpopulated. They grow really fast, they spread fast, and they cause ecological, environmental, or economic harm. So when we're talking about that great northern hornet, or the giant northern hornet, the big problem with that species is that it eats other insects. It will actually eat our local pollinators. So that's why it's been put on a watch list, because it can have massive impacts on local ecosystems as it moves through. And then a naturalized species is a species that has been established in a non-native ecosystem, but it's able to grow and reproduce and populate without causing harm or displacement. So this is where our honeybee comes into the discussion, where no, they're not native to Ontario or Canada. However, they don't displace local pollinators, so they're considered naturalized. Anybody have any questions? All right. So what attracts a pollinator? There's a long list of things, but they each have kind of a a term associated with them. So it's called pollinator syndromes, and no, this is not meaning you are sick in any way. The pollinators are healthy, but a pollinator syndrome will describe flower characteristics or traits that have evolved to attract certain pollinators. So these characteristics can be used to predict what type of pollinator are going to be attracted to a certain plant. So these include things like color, nectar presence, or abundance. So things like hummingbirds, they really do love flowers with a lot of nectar because they have to burn so much energy just flying around. Pollen presence, the odor coming off of a plant. So we talked about, flower flies versus filth flies. So the type of scent that a plant gives off will sometimes dictate the pollinator that visits it. The shape of the flower and bloom time. And these relationships fall typically into two categories. The first is a mutualistic relationship. So this is where both your plant and your animal or insect are benefiting from the relationship. So the flower gets its pollen passed on or gets fertilized, and the insect or animal that's visiting that flower is either eating the pollen for protein or drinking the nectar for energy. That's like a carbohydrate for them. Or sometimes, depending on when that flower fruits, they're getting a snack. So the other term used to describe these relationships is a lot less common, but it's commensalism. And this is where one entity is benefiting and the other one is unaffected. So this is kind of where we think of bats landing in the spectrum, where the flowers are benefiting from having the pollen passed on, they're benefiting from having, their pests eaten. The bat is not really getting anything from the pollen or the flower. Another good example would be like certain types of butterflies. They will visit and lay their eggs on the leaves of plants and pass on pollen. Now the adult butterfly isn't gaining anything from that. She's just meandering through, laying her eggs, while the flower gets its pollen passed on. So that's a commensalistic relationship. The larvae that hatch out of that egg, though, are parasites on that plant, unfortunately. So when they hatch, they start eating the leaves. The plant's not gaining anything, but the larvae certainly are. They're able to grow and, pupate because of the energy that they get from that plant. So there are different types of relationships within the plant pollinator system. So the first I will talk a little bit on. So I'm going to go in a little more in depth on 3 of these different syndromes. So the first is color. So depending on the color of the plant in question or the flower in question, you're going to have different pollinators attracted. So beetles tend to be attracted to the color green. They see it very vibrantly. So green, white, lighter colors. Bees and flies are kind of cool, and the reason that this picture is split in half is because it shows the yellow part of the flower is what we see. The white and black portion of the picture is actually what a bee or a fly would see when looking at this flower. So they see in the UV spectrum, and because they've evolved so closely with flowering plants, the plants have essentially created like a landing pad, a zone that attracts them to be like, hey, here, land here, this is where the pollen is, come to this point. So you can look up different pictures of this. It's really, really cool. Like dandelions, for example. Again, I like dandelions. They're fluffy, they're fun, but they're not exactly the most interesting flower to look at until you look at them in the UV spectrum. They've got a really cool color scheme and pattern. So that's your homework. Look up dandelions in the UV spectrum. They're awesome. There's also a BBC series called Life in Color by David Attenborough, and it goes more in depth about this. So if you're interested, check that one out. It explains how it happens and like how the eyes actually work on these insects to be able to see that in different ways. And then the last one is the example that I'm going to use is hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are really attracted to the color red, and this is why they are one of the more important pollinators for plants that bees don't typically visit. And that's because bees don't see red the way we see red. In that UV spectrum, red is actually just black. So they're not super attracted to plants that are red because they don't have that, landing pad design, where hummingbirds are going to see the way that we see, and they really like that color red and will come and visit more often. All right. Next, we're going to touch on shape. So shape is another really important part of flower design, depending on the pollinator that plant is aiming for. So some things to think about are how it relates to the animal or insect's anatomy, so the way that that animal or insect is shaped in relation to the flower's shape. Does the pollinator land, or does it hover like a hummingbird does? How big is the insect or animal? And how does it behave while searching for food? These are all things you need to think about if you're trying to, pair a plant with a certain type of pollinator. So butterflies will really like flowers that are tubular, but have a wide landing point. So they like to be able to rest while they eat. And butterflies actually have a really long tongue. It's pretty cool if you ever see one stick out their tongue to drink nectar. It's basically like a long straw. And so they can get right down into those tubular flowers, which typically have a high level of nectar production, and it's like this little puddle inside. So they can reach all the way down to get that nectar. Moths like being able to sit on a large landing zone, and they're typically going to aim for flowers that kind of match the way they're colored or shaped. So the top right picture is of a May apple. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's actually a moth on that flower. It's got its head tucked right into the middle. It looks like it's part of the flower, so it has a certain degree of safety while sitting and eating, that it's not going to get picked off by a bird. White flower, white moth. Really difficult to see, but I think it's so cool the way that these relationships work. Bees tend to like a more shallow flower, but again, they want that landing pad, which is why when we think about that flower that we saw in the UV spectrum, it's got that kind of target to it. They like to be able to sit and rest while they are collecting either the pollen or the nectar that they're there for. Flies and flower flies specifically are very similar to bees in the shape of flower and color that they're attracted to. While filth flies, again that term, they like a more complex structure that they can crawl through. And if you think about that in terms of what else they might land on, if that's carrion, if it's excrement, then they like to be able to, again, it's kind of a safety thing, but get out of sight of something that might eat them, like a bird that's going to come down and pick them off the flower. So if they're going to land on a flower, they're going to look for something with a more complex structure that can hide them while they're collecting their resource. And then beetles are kind of cool. They tend to go for a larger, more cupped shape. So if we think of like a water lily, that's the type of flower that a beetle's going to go for. Again, with those lighter colors. So things like green, things like white, those are the typical shaped flowers and color that's going to match up with your beetle. And last, the one that tends to get forgotten, but is really important, is bloom time. So perfect picture, a sunflower tracks the sun throughout the day. It's going to be visited by pollinators that are active during the daytime. However, like moths and bats and some of our other pollinator species, not all pollinators are active during the day. So the ones that are active during the night have co-evolved with flowers that bloom at dusk or at nighttime. So the one picture here is actually called a moonflower. Again, something cool if you want to look it up is building a moon garden. So those flowers that open up in the evening, they spend all day photosynthesizing, gathering energy from the sun, and then at night, they open their flowers to attract their pollinator of choice. So all of this put together, all of these things are really important when we're thinking about the different species of pollinators we have, how you might want to attract those pollinators, and why they might visit a garden or ecosystem. So that's everything for me. Thank you for joining.